The room went silent the moment Dutch Schultz pulled the gun. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a sudden stop in conversation. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence where men stop breathing because they are terrified the sound of their own lungs might trigger a massacre. In that suite, the molecules of the air seemed to crystallize into a single, sharp point of lethal intent. 12 of the most dangerous minds in America suddenly realized they were no longer sitting in a boardroom. They were standing on the absolute razor's edge of history. October 15th, 1935. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, New York City. Suite 39C. This wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. This was the sanctum. This was the inner chamber of the commission, Lucky Luciano's grand corporate masterpiece. For 4 long, bloody years, Lucky had worked tirelessly to dismantle the chaotic, mustache-Pete era of the old world and replace it with the cold, efficient order of the new. No more senseless street brawls. No more boss of bosses claiming supreme authority through the barrel of a gun. He had built a system of 5 families and 12 votes, wrapped in the pretense of civilization. But in the center of that smoke-filled suite, that pretense was about to be shredded by a man who didn't believe in democracy. Arthur Flegenheimer, the man the world knew as the Dutchman, was unraveling in front of their eyes. To the public, he was the Bronx beer baron, a titan who had survived the lean years of prohibition to build an empire. But to the men sitting around that mahogany table, he was a mad dog who had finally reached the end of his chain. The Dutchman was being hunted, and he was cornered. Thomas Dewey, the relentless special prosecutor, was dismantling Dutch's Harlem numbers racket, piece by piece, ledger by ledger. Dewey was a new kind of threat, a man you couldn't bribe, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't buy. He was a crusader, and Dutch Schultz knew with a terrifying certainty that crusaders only stopped when the iron door of a cell slammed shut for the final time. Dutch had come to this emergency meeting with a simple, violent solution. Kill Dewey. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. He wanted to make it look like a random street mugging gone wrong, a tragic headline in the morning paper that would solve all their problems. But Lucky Luciano had already looked him in the eye and said the one word Dutch's ego couldn't handle. No. Dutch Schultz didn't just disagree, he snapped. He stood up so violently that his heavy oak chair clattered against the floorboards like a starting pistol. His veins were bulging like whipcords in his neck, and his face had turned the deep bruised color of raw steak. His hands, usually steady, were shaking with a manic, uncontainable rage. He reached into the dark silk lining of his jacket and pulled out a .45 automatic, leveling it across the table until the barrel was centered directly on the ice bridge of Lucky Luciano's nose. In the meticulously ordered world of the commission, this was the ultimate heresy. To pull steel in the Waldorf was to declare war on the system itself. Dutch's finger was white-knuckled on the trigger. He began to scream, his voice a jagged edge that sliced through the room. He called Lucky a punk from the Lower East Side. He roared that he had been building his empire while Lucky was still stealing bread from street vendors. He told him that the commission was nothing but a cage, and he was through being locked inside by a man who thought votes were more powerful than lead. He thought he held the leverage. He thought that because he held the steel, he held the power of life and death over the room. But as Lucky Luciano looked into the black empty void of that .45 barrel, he didn't blink. He didn't lean back in fear. He didn't even signal to the armed bodyguard standing just outside the door. Lucky Luciano simply looked at him with eyes that were as cold and dead as a winter morning. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, yet it carried more weight than Dutch's screaming. He told the Dutchman that if he pulled that trigger, he better be prepared to execute every single man sitting at that table before they could draw their own weapons. because the second Lucky's blood touched the carpet, Dutch would be marked for a kind of death that no man survives. He told him he would have 11 families, 11 organizations, and every hired gun from Brooklyn to Chicago hunting him down. He told him that he wasn't just trying to kill a man, he was trying to kill a machine. And machines don't die with a single bullet. Dutch Schultz had come to the Waldorf expecting a plea for mercy. What he found was the cold mathematical realization that he was already a ghost. He didn't realize that by pulling that gun, he hadn't just threatened a boss, he had signed his own death warrant, and the ink had dried the moment he'd touched the trigger. Before we reveal the secret, shadow mechanics of how Lucky Luciano used the streets of Harlem to erase the Dutchman forever, and the bloody price Dutch paid in a Newark chop house, hit that subscribe button. The history books say Dutch Schultz died in a gang war. The streets know the truth. He died the moment he forgot that you don't lead with a gun. You lead with a vision. To understand why a man as volatile as Dutch Schultz believed he could bully the throne of the commission, you have to understand the lucrative hunting ground he was trying to protect. By 1935, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a multi-million-dollar gold mine. And Dutch Schultz, born Arthur Flegenheimer, was the self-appointed iron-fisted tax collector. He sat atop the numbers racket, a sprawling gambling empire built on the small hopes and hard-earned nickels of a community that had been systematically denied any other form of investment. But Dutch was a policy king who ruled by the blade and the blunt instrument. He was a creature of the old world, a man who didn't understand that an empire built solely on fear is a hollow structure that eventually collapses under its own weight. Lucky Luciano, however, was a different breed of predator. Lucky looked at the streets of Harlem and saw more than just a source of quick, unwashed cash. He saw a vital strategic square on a much larger chessboard. He recognized that Dutch's mad dog tactics, the public beatings, the high-profile murders, and the constant vibrating aura of violence, were drawing the kind of heat that kills a business from the inside out. Luciano knew that for the syndicate to survive, it had to become invisible, woven into the fabric of the city like a legitimate corporation. And then there was the Joe Louis factor, the pivot point where the Dutchman's greed finally collided with a power he couldn't intimidate. Joe Louis was the brown bomber, a figure who transcended the sport of boxing. In an era of crushing segregation, he was a towering symbol of black dignity and excellence. When Joe Louis fought, the world stopped. When he won, the streets of Harlem erupted in a rare, pure joy. But outside the safety of the ropes, Joe was a target. The mob didn't want to knock him out. They wanted to own him. They wanted to turn his cultural capital into a private ATM for the Genovese and Schultz interests. The trap they laid for the champ was an elegant piece of legal thievery called the Golden Handcuffs. A group of investors, frontmen acting on behalf of Dutch Schultz's shadow interests, approached Joe with what looked like a dream. They offered him a partnership in a new, prestigious string of nightclubs. They pitched it as a chance for Joe to finally be an owner of the very venues that had made millions off his name. To a young Joe Louis who believed in the value of a man's word and the honor of a handshake, it looked like a legacy. It looked like freedom. In reality, the contract was a bust-out masterpiece. The fine print was a suffocating labyrinth of debt clauses, indemnity agreements, and personal liability. If Joe signed that paper, the mob wouldn't just take his initial investment. They would legally seize control of his future, fight purses, his properties, and his very name. They were attempting to turn the heavyweight champion of the world into a high-priced, indentured servant to the Dutchman's whims. Joe Louis was a god with a pair of gloves on, but in a windowless room full of high-priced lawyers and predatory contracts, he was dangerously out of his depth. He didn't see the sharks circling beneath the surface of the ink, But there was one man in Harlem who saw every ripple in the water. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. History books often relegate Bumpy to the role of a mere gangster, but the streets knew him by a different title, the Gatekeeper. Bumpy was a chess player and a mathematician of the underworld. He understood the Mati, golden handcuffs scam better than the men who wrote it, because he knew exactly how the mind of Dutch Schultz functioned. He knew that Dutch didn't want partners. He wanted puppets who could be discarded once their strings were frayed. Bumpy saw the move being made on the brown bomber. He recognized that the attempt to trap Joe Louis wasn't just a robbery. It was an assault on the spirit of Harlem itself. While Lucky Luciano was downtown in the Waldorf Astoria, trying to manage the Dutchman's explosive temper with diplomacy, Bumpy was uptown, preparing to manage the Dutchman's greed with cold, hard reality. Bumpy wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of absolute consequence. He realized that if Joe Louis signed that paper, the Italian and German mob would have a foothold in the heart of Harlem that could never be removed. The Dutchman thought he was playing a high-stakes game of power against Luciano in the midtown luxury of the Waldorf. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he didn't realize that uptown, in the shadows of the Apollo Theater, Bumpy Johnson had already decided that the game was over. Schultz was worried about a special prosecutor with a legal mandate. He should have been worried about the man who actually owned the pavement he was trying to rob. The room felt like a trap because the atmosphere was thick with the scent of a kill. Dutch Schultz's associates, 3 men who dressed like bankers but thought like vultures, were waiting in a private back room of a Harlem social club. They had the papers laid out across a mahogany table like a funeral shroud, and their confidence was absolute. They had spent their careers bullying tenement owners and small-time shopkeepers. They believed that a man who solved his problems with his fists, like Joe Louis, would be helpless against the jagged edges of a legal document. They thought they were the only wolves in the room. They were wrong. The door didn't just open, it swung wide with the slow, deliberate weight of a judge entering a courtroom. Bumpy Johnson walked in. He didn't come with a shouting army or a show of weapons. He didn't need to. He carried the quiet, vibrating authority of a man who could command the silence of 10 city blocks with a single nod. He walked to the head of the table and remained standing. He didn't sit because sitting is for men who have time to negotiate. Bumpy was there to deliver a verdict. He didn't look at the vultures, he looked at the room, measuring the exits, the angles, and the intent of every soul present. He picked up the golden handcuffs contract. He didn't read it word for word, he didn't have to. He scanned the pages with the cold, analytical eyes of a man who had seen 1,000 variations of the same lie. Schultz's associates started to speak, their voices slick with a practiced, oily condescension. They tried to explain the unprecedented opportunity. They tried to talk about diversification and passive income. They eventually mentioned the Dutchman's name, dropping it into the conversation like a heavy stone, using it as a shield to remind Bumpy who they represented. Bumpy let them finish. He let the silence stretch until it became a physical pressure in their chests, making it difficult for them to swallow. Then he looked the lead associate in the eye, a man who had spent his life hiding behind the Dutchman's shadow, and told him that the only thing being invested in that room today was their lives. He didn't scream. He didn't even raise his voice. He used psychological dominance like a surgeon uses a scalpel. He told them that Joe Louis was the pride of Harlem, the physical manifestation of the community's hope, and that Harlem didn't take kindly to outsiders putting a leash on its gods. He explained, in a voice as smooth and cold as a marble slab, that if that contract wasn't destroyed within the next 60 seconds, the Dutchman wouldn't just lose a business deal. He would lose every man he had stationed north of 110th Street. Bumpy informed them that while they were downtown at the Waldorf, trembling at the thought of Thomas Dewey and his prosecutors, Bumpy was right here, in the heart of the empire, and he was the one they should be worrying about. The lead associate looked at the door. He looked at Bumpy's hands, which were perfectly still on the table. He looked out the window and saw the silhouettes of Bumpy's men, stationary, silent observers in the rain, waiting for a signal. In that moment, he realized that the name Dutch Schultz carried no currency in this zip code. Here, Bumpy Johnson was the law, the enforcer, and the one who handled the burials. The associate's hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. He reached for the contract. Slowly, with a sound that felt as loud as a bone snapping in the quiet room, he tore the thick, expensive linen paper down the middle. Then again, and again, the scraps of the golden handcuffs fluttered onto the table like dirty snow. Bumpy watched the destruction with an impassive face. He watched the mob's leverage turn into confetti. He told them to take the scraps back to the Dutchman and deliver a message. Harlem was officially closed for his kind of business. As they scrambled out of the room, Bumpy remained stationary. He had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar extortion plot without throwing a single punch, proving the ultimate truth of the underworld. A gangster needs a gun to be heard, but a king only needs to speak. The aftermath of that night wasn't marked by a public celebration or headlines in the Amsterdam news. It was marked by a profound, silent shift in the wind. When Joe Louis was eventually told that the golden handcuffs had been reduced to trash, he didn't just feel the weight of the debt lift. He felt an awakening. He realized that the world outside the boxing ring was governed by a different, more treacherous set of physics. But not the ring. You could see the punch coming. You could train for it. In the boardroom, the blow that kills your future is hidden in a single paragraph on page 20 of a document you didn't even know you should have read. Joe Louis went on to become the longest reigning heavyweight champion in history, a record that stands as a testament to his physical greatness. But his true victory was the preservation of his autonomy. While he would later face the relentless pursuit of the IRS, a government mob that even Bumpy Johnson couldn't intimidate, he never again let a man in a silk suit put a leash on his legacy. He learned the lesson Bumpy had written for him in that Harlem back room. A man's signature is his soul. If you give it away to people you don't trust, you've lost the fight before the bell even rings. As for Dutch Schultz, the mad dog of the Bronx, his clock finally ran out exactly 8 days after he committed the heresy of pulling a gun on Lucky Luciano. On October 23, 1935, the Dutchman was cornered in the men's room of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He didn't see the hitmen from Murder Inc. coming. He didn't see the commission's final verdict until the lead was already tearing through his midsection. He died a rambling, fever-dream death in a hospital bed. A man who thought he could bully the future, only to be erased by it. Lucky Luciano had won, not through a spectacular shootout in the Waldorf Astoria, but through the cold, calculated mechanics of the organization he had created. He had proven that the era of the individual ego was dead. The era of the board of directors, of corporate crime governed by rules and stability, had arrived. But the real victory belonged to the streets. Bumpy Johnson remained the undisputed king of Harlem for 3 more decades, a man who understood that true power isn't measured by how much you can take, but by what you are willing to protect. He and Lucky Luciano had drawn a line in the Harlem soil that the downtown families would rarely dare to cross again. They proved that even in a world built on the foundations of crime, there is a code that must be respected. History is written in the textbooks, sanitized and simplified. But the truth is whispered in the shadows of the tenements on 125th Street. It is a story of expectation versus reality. Dutch Schultz expected to be a king through violence. He ended up a ghost, Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson. They didn't just survive the chaos, they became the myth. If you understand that the most dangerous weapon in any room isn't always the one you can see, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, was Lucky Luciano a visionary for building the commission, or did he just find a more efficient way to kill his competition? I'm reading every response. This is Untold Mafia Stories. We'll see you in the next chapter.